And welcome everyone this afternoon. I'm going to rattle through quite a number of different ideas today, and then I'll leave some time for some Q&A as well. But I think just to anchor us in why we're here is we have no time left to address climate change. We've got to get on and start making things and acting. We've got about 9 years if we want to try and hit the Paris targets, and there's a less than 50% chance of us getting to 1.5. So when we look at this kind of more broadly, our challenge is how do we sustain 8 billion people or more while hitting peak everything everywhere all at once. And that covers a whole range of different issues, from food security to biodiversity to climate. But climate, if you like, is a root cause of a lot of these issues. And when we look at what's happening with the global financial markets, global policy, climate is where the action is in terms of trying to get stuff done. However, the data is appalling. And what I want to start with is just talking about the difference between our financial economy and the real economy. Now, these might sound like kind of weird kind of concepts. How do you separate them? Well, the financial economy, it has very little to do with the real economy in many ways. It looks at asset pricing. It's the reason we have things like the subprime crisis that hit us a decade ago. We may be approaching other subprime crises in insurance and other categories as people start to quantify the actual physical risk in our financial systems. Whereas the real economy actually relates to things we make and things we consume. And you'd like to think that these things are joined up. I want to talk a little bit about how much they're not joined up. And when you look at a credit rating, for example, there's very little correlation between that and the actual carbon emissions that are happening on the ground. So let's look at what is the kind of information flow here. When we're thinking about data and its flow, we've got resources that go in through distribution. We make things. That information goes into carbon accounting packages. They use models from places like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol that says, if you use X kilowatt hours of electricity at this time, then it generates this amount of kilograms of CO2. Or if you grow this amount of wheat over this period of time in this country, you'll generate this amount of greenhouse gas emissions. All of that gets bundled up into reports, and those reports then get consumed by rating agencies and used in financial decisions. In some cases, they try and audit them. But if you have a Google around, even right now, over the last few weeks, and look at the voluntary carbon markets for offsets, you'll find that they're not maybe as auditable and credible as we might wish them to be. However, there have also been huge success stories in carbon markets, and they have also driven billions of investment into solar and wind and so on. I think this one, just pause on that. The scale of investment that's coming is going to dwarf what we've seen in the past. So I was on a call just recently where there's moves to invest 7 trillion by 2030 in getting us to net zero. There's a huge amount of capital coming. The question is it going to deliver? And can we guarantee that it's going to deliver? Because it's not like missing a financial target in the stock market being a bit annoyed. If we miss the net zero target, there's different consequences. And I'm not going to get into the physics of that and the implications, but let's just imagine there's 100 million climate refugees by the end of this century moving across country borders. Just think through the implications of that. So we need this overseen in different ways by government, by policy and regulation, and obviously there's supranational bodies like the IPCC, which is actually bringing us the climate science in a comprehensive way. But it's not a good news story from the climate science point of view. I mean, we're kind of running out of time. I'd say we're out of time. The infrastructure investments that we're going to make by 2030 are going to determine our 2050 carbon impact. So we are very limited in counting in years now to really try and get to a net zero future. And when you look at the complexity of this chart, there's a lot of different people in this, and they've got lots of different interests. And the data is everywhere. The data is in utilities, in electric vehicles, it's in factories, it's in SMEs. The reporting is all over the place. There's loads of different standards. There are global standards in development. They're taking a while to arrive at us, so we need to kind of crack on. So when we look at the ecosystem of what is net zero data, it's kind of everything. But let's not try and boil all the oceans at once. I'm not going to include telecoms and your personal health records and all that stuff for now. Let's focus on our industrial sectors, look at energy in the built world, look at agriculture, look at water, look at transport. But how they, if you look at energy, for example, the kind of demand response markets, flexibility markets, our energy systems are being decentralized and disaggregated as we speak. As people put solar and wind on their properties, as you've got an electric vehicle on your driveway, suddenly we've got all these interoperability challenges that span energy and transport. Our energy infrastructure is driving around. How do we measure that? How do we quantify it? Who pays? So one of the challenges I think we all face as we try and get organizations to think about data and digital is that quite often people think about, oh, I've got a building or I've got an organization, I can put everything in one place and then I'll have more control over it. And that is fundamentally not the way to think about a digital world. So if you're bringing physical world thinking to your digital strategy, you're making a grave error of judgment. And I want to unpack a little bit of that as we go through this. We need digital thinking first. And just as a couple of anecdotes here, we're already digital first. There's more people online than existed when I was born. There's more machines online than people. I think it's about 10 billion things connected to the internet now. And so we're already digital first. This idea that it's later is not, it's now. We've got satellites doing whole Earth observation at 2-meter resolution, multispectral every day. So we know where all the trees are, we know where all the resources are, and we can track them or some people can track them on a daily basis. We look at COVID. That was kind of interesting chart here. This is the daily fossil fuel emissions throughout lockdown. You can see transport dipped quite a lot. I should say the scale here goes from 100 to 80, not 100 to 0. So we saw nearly 15% drop in emissions from transport, from industry, power, 5% drop. Residential went up a little bit. But one of the interesting things about COVID is suddenly governments around the world pulled all their magic levers and said, we've got to stop. We've got to create an intervention to address a crisis. And I need to do that again. But trying to do that again in a controlled way is part of the challenge. And politicians tend not to want to do that. What they can do is say, well, if we can prove that the investments that we're going to make, the interventions we're going to make, are going to create a lower carbon future without completely destroying our economy in the process, then we can do that. And we've got mechanisms for data sharing that already exist that work. So open banking, which I co-chaired back in 2015, is now out in the market. It's regulated in the UK. There are hundreds of fintechs using it, millions of people using it. It's been copied in 80 countries to varying degrees. And I know this is a big leap to go all this data stuff, open banking. But what open banking does is it says to an entire sector, we will have a common way of sharing data. We will use the same processes, we'll have the same licensing conditions for data usage, we'll have ways of suing each other. And actually that's a really important point when you're dealing with data, is who can sue who. Because once you've set up a legal structure where there's a liability, actually the lawyers calm down. They go, okay, well, we know if something goes wrong, we know who to call. And that creates a set of behaviors. Now, open banking is a $20 billion market, $23 billion market now. It's expected to grow to $120 billion in the next 10 years or so. So that's kind of a good success story from my point of view. There's still really early days. We haven't even scratched the surface of what I think open banking can do. But part of my thinking in setting up Icebreaker was, could we take the model here, and at the heart of this model is the thing called a trust framework, which says, can everybody in this ecosystem play together in a way that they've all agreed? And in some cases, can we make that regulated? So when we think about data, it's not about digitalization. It's not the new oil. Anyone who says data is new oil, please send them to me. I will send them into somewhere. Really, data is about unlocking business value. And there's a kind of core concept here that we like to connect, don't collect. Data increases in value the more it's connected in a digital age. So the idea of putting everything in one place and putting a paywall up against it is an outmoded way of thinking about value creation. We can monetize the value exchange that is generated from sharing data. And in open banking, it can be pennies per API call. There are business models that support this. It's not about giving it all away for free. In fact, please don't give it all away for free, because that's not sustainable. So we've started at Icebreaker One as an intervention. So we launched opennetzero.org to say, what data do you need? And can you find it? Organizations are still, in terms of data maturity, at ground zero. They are still working out what data they've got before they've even worked out who their users are. So we launched this very much as a provocation to say, if you can't find what data you need in order to make net zero decisions, tell us what you do need, and we'll go and help you find it. If you do have data that's relevant, can we index it? And that data, whether you've got data that is open data, so it can be used by anyone for any purpose for free, under an open license, that's the easy bit. But could you also make metadata available, so data that describes the data that you have, even if that data is commercial and licensed and you have to pay for? Could you create an openly licensed description of that data so we can index it? Because if we can index it, then other people can find it. It sounds weird describing this in 2023 when we've had Google for 25 years. Right? It's ludicrous. But we still haven't sorted out, as a community, as industry, as countries, the very basics of data discoverability. And so the provocation here is say, can we find open data and what we call shared data? And if you're familiar with the data spectrum, the shared data bit in the middle there is what we're trying to tackle. Colleagues at the Open Data Institute in the front here are tackling the open data bit. So there's a lot of common cause here. So we've indexed a lot of things. You can go into different taxonomies to do with the infinity of ways that people are starting to describe data in this space. But you'll see at the bottom left here, licensing is part of the search criteria. So what licenses are available? And this is the beginning of a journey. This is, how do we get simple access? And this is just using SOOCon. There's no magic here. It just is, how do we get people to describe what they are doing in a way that we can enable other people to discover it as a service? And the next step of that journey is to say, okay, so you've all got wildly different licensing conditions. If you think about energy, in the UK, there's 8,000 companies in the energy sector in the UK and somehow involved in that sector. How are they all going to share information? Are we going to have 8,000 bilateral contracts for each one of them? No, that's not going to scale. So how do we create common licensing frameworks and common trust frameworks that can enable organizations to agree and share information? So that's where the data spectrum comes in here, and we've evolved the data spectrum diagram to give it some dimensions, and that's around risks and controls. So we're using the language of business. The lawyers and the compliance officers are the ones who really care about this, want to know, what's my liability? What are the risks involved? So here we've started to define shared data in the way that we didn't quite get there with the ODI. We define open data, but our experience and building on that is to say, how can we create preemptive licenses for whole sectors? That's what open banking effectively does for the banking sector. And there'll be lots of things that remain closed that are either just not shared or have bilateral contracts. Don't mess with that. It's fine. If people are sharing information with each other, there's 8 of them, they've got bilateral contracts, fine. When there's a many-to-many relationship that needs to be built, rather than an any-to-any relationship, which is where open data sits, then there's a call for common action. So one of the programs we launched just last week, and we've had our first steering group meeting, which has got the ICAW, which represents the accounting sector, Federation of Small Businesses, BAYS, or whatever BAYS is going to be called tomorrow, and the Institute of Directors, the OECD, as a steering group to help convene everybody around this program, is to help unlock access to capital
to fund SMEs on that journey to net zero in an assurable way. And the way we're starting that journey is with energy. So over the last couple of years, Icebreaker One's been building open energy. It's an equivalent to the open banking standard. And what we want to do is enable access to the banks. The banks carry the liability for net zero on their loan books. So they have a liability sitting there that they need to quantify better, so they need better data. So he said, rather than going through all of the machinations of Scope 1, which is all of your consumption of everything, Scope 2, all your energy consumption, Scope 3, all of your supply chain, to try and create a carbon footprint for an SME. SME has no time, no money, and no inclination really, and no incentive to do this. So let's just start with energy. And we enable that SME to share their energy data seamlessly with their bank. Now, if they can do that, the bank can start to de-risk their loan book. The bank can then go back to the SME and say, actually, we could give you a preferential loan for some low-carbon technology, let's say a heat pump. And if we've got this wired up properly, then the bank will be able to see the impact of that investment the month after the heat pump's been switched on. And the auditors can come along and assure that and say we can prove that this shift has happened in a way that they cannot do today. And so we're looking at this from a whole systems perspective of saying how can we bring together all of these different actors and do this for the whole of the SME community in the UK by COP this year. So that's the scale of ambition. We like small projects. Can we convene banking sector, the energy sector, bits of government, and all agree a common standard in 9 months? We'll see. But as an illustration here, I just wanted to show on this diagram, this is the same process as open banking. The data is never centralized. The consent management process here for an SME to share their energy data with their bank is that the bank says, is it okay if I share this information? The energy company says, are you sure? The data then flows directly from the energy company to the bank. The thing that oversees that whole transaction, the rules, if you like, the rules of that game, it's called a trust framework, which we've built around open energy. And that sits separately. That's why we're an independent non-profit. We have to sit outside of the market, and we have to enable these transactions. So there's a process there that's proven. You probably have used open banking, even if you haven't noticed. And that's enabled a whole range of innovation to be unlocked in the UK. So I'm just going to finish off with some of our guiding principles here, because this is just one example of many. Now, there's other examples, like if I park my EV at your house when I'm visiting and it's charged by your neighbour's solar panel, who pays who? You know, that is a really difficult question to answer. And we can't answer it unless we have radical interoperability between all of the systems in that chain, from domestic battery storage through to a substation, through to an EV charging point, through to the vehicle, and so on. So there's a huge mesh of stuff here that has to be collectively addressed. So we've developed these principles over the last couple of years, which are really just to try and anchor us in what are our guiding principles for the future. So that trusted data is essential to delivering net zero. If we don't, money will not flow, or the money will flow to the wrong things. If we can't hold people to account, we're not going to get to net zero. Access to net zero data must be open. That doesn't mean an open data license on everything. It means open access, not open data. Open data for some of it, shared data for other bits, but the open access piece applies to the standards. We have open interoperability across the market. The rules for data sharing should address public and private sector needs. Government must be involved in this. We've not seen instances of commercial actors getting together and getting it all right. There are great initiatives out there. It's not to diminish any of them. But to do this well and to go far, we've got to go together. Net zero data infrastructure must be governed openly and independently. It needs to sit outside of commercial sector and probably outside of government. It might be the role of the ODI, might be the role of the open banking implementation entity, which does it for banking. It might be bits for an icebreaker. That's to be decided, to be determined. And finally, that net zero data infrastructure requires mandates for engagement. This isn't going to happen without a government push. Industry likes to lean in, but it needs a shove if we're going to do it quickly. So I'm going to stop there and go for questions. So I'm sure that I've covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time. Questions?
I'm greedy, I have two, if this is possible. Yeah? The first one is like, you made a good analogy around the open banking standards. How much was it there just creating the trust framework, and how much was it actually government with the stick saying you have to implement this? And obviously, and how will this work in this context?
That's a great question. So in the UK, I had a call from Treasury to say thank you very much for agreeing to co-chair the open banking standards, so voluntold into that role. So Treasury's push at that point was absolutely essential. You can imagine that all of the banks quite rightly said, well, we've got APIs. We're using open standards. We've got open source over there. But it wasn't clear. And in most cases, it wasn't legal for people to be sharing their data. The consumer rights were not fully addressed. They were notionally addressed through GDPR. But one of the ways of thinking about open banking is it actually codified GDPR into an actual use case that we could then go, does it work? So a lot of the effort around open banking was around the legal structures and liability structures. It's then gone through a regulated process, but the regulation only applies to the main 9 banks. But because of the way we structured it, 9 banks are regulated. They must do it this way. And because the open banking implementation entity has a trust framework mechanism, they all had to sign up to it. And the way of getting it to work in the market is to say all the other fintechs have to sign up to the same service. So even though the fintechs and the other hundreds of organizations in the mix there are not regulated, they're effectively covered under the same regulatory umbrella. And so there's a cohesion across the market that didn't exist before. And so if you're a fintech and want to integrate with the banking system, that's your route rather than doing it multiple times. Now, we take this to other sectors, the number of many-to-many relationships multiplies exponentially. You look at energy, there's thousands of different applications. And so stepping through this is not easy. We've got to take a use case-led approach. You've got to take the minimum viable example and step that through and get everybody comfortable and in a room and then agree it. So government intervention in the UK was essential. I helped with the implementation of open banking in New Zealand. That was done through a trade association. They got together and said, let's run ahead. We can see what the UK is doing. Let's copy it quickly. They got to market in 2 years. We didn't get the whole market there. They got most of the market there. And so there's a conversation about needing now government regulation to get the whole market into the tent. So again, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, you've got to go together. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
The other one, just on this case that you had around, I know the answer was a bit long, so it was around the use case that you presented with the energy of an SME. And I'm an SME. I don't know what my energy footprint is. I've got a co-working space that I sometimes share in London. I sit at home in my garden office. I've got a cloud infrastructure. So how do I sort of participate?
Absolutely, exactly. A good question. Yeah. There are many challenges under the hood of this particular box that we're opening the lid on. It is a Pandora's box. Just to be clear, energy companies don't necessarily know where the meters are or where the buildings are that the meters are in or whether the meter is connected to the right organization in the first place. So it's going to be messy to begin with. But I actually wonder if in this process, because the banks do know where their customers are because they're regulated in a different way. Right? So maybe there's a benefit here to the energy companies for working with the banks to do some more of that KYC, know your customer, and assurance process around who is who in the system. And the banks are also already doing spend-based analysis, so they could look at your AWS account and say, well, you're spending this much on a cloud provider. We have a metric for that. But that's on that earlier chart. The methodologies also need a huge amount of work. The error bars on those are huge. So we're at the beginning of this journey. I can't overstate that. Literally, we had our first steering group last week. So that's the beginning of getting people around the table. We've just decided to set a very short timeline because we don't have any more time.
Nicely done, Gavin. Please join me in thanking Gavin Starks.